There was no Shakti. They gave rise to each other. See, the two energies gave rise to each other. And he went on from that to say that our great challenge was to get into sync with those frequencies and allow and let them manifest for us, because then we would discover that we were both equally. We are that Shiva, and we are that Shakti, and we are the creative process which arises from our heart. And he went on to say something even more outlandish. He said, there's only one heart. He said, the one beating in my chest, the one beating in your chest, same in everybody. The very same thing in all humans. There's only one heart. But that heart takes on the colorations and specific characteristics of the ego up here in the head. You remember Paul Pearsall wrote a book called about that very issue. He was very much struck by the fact when you have a heart transplant, that quite often the recipient of that heart from someone else took on the characteristics of the person that owned the heart in the first place. I discussed that with a group of cardiologists in Sydney, Australia, who had discovered this themselves way back years ago, that when they made a cardiac transplant, the person getting the heart, you had to be careful, they'd start and act out behaviors of the person who owned the heart in the first place. And if this happened to be a woman, and she gets the heart of a beer-drinking, smoking motorcycle rider, it allowed to be some confusion in personalities. So, I remember this teacher in India saying, millions and millions of little egos up here in the head, only one heart. So the heart is the shared universal process which we are equally. And at the same time, it gives rise to this incredible ego structure up here in the head. The word ego being simply Latin for I, and it's not a dirty word in my lexicon, or nor was it in the wording of these Shaivites. That gets us to the next issue here. And here again, I always get stuck as to which comes first, which do we need first. And it suddenly occurs to me that we need to discuss just a little bit the business of being coherent or out of coherence. What do we mean by entrainment? Is when the frequencies of the heart match other frequencies from other hearts, or the frequencies produced by the earth itself. That's when these wave fields, their peaks and troughs, match. And you'll find that when you're in coherence, or when you're in sync with yourself, I mentioned a while ago, when heart, brain, body, and all come into coherence, you have a single pulsation, which comes from the body as a unit. Now that's when they're coherent. And they're coherent only so long as you are in a good emotional state with yourself. If I'm thinking one thing in my head, speaking something differently with my voice, and acting differently with my body, I'm a house divided against itself. And there's no wholeness in me. There's no coherence in me. And as a result, those frequencies which I'm producing in my heart are out of sync. First of all, with the other frequencies in my body, the frequencies of my brain and so on and so forth, they're all incoherent with each other, and what do? They clash. It's sort of like static on a radio. The signal from the sending station is still perfectly clear, perfectly powerful. They can send those, that radio station can send those out over a great wide area. Where does the trouble lie? In my receiver. My receiver is out of whack, so instead of picking up the signals from that, I get static. And so we find that's what happens to us if that which we're thinking in our heart is different from that which we're thinking in our head. Got it? Simple. Thus endeth the Sunday lesson. This isn't even Sunday yet. So this is something we have to realize, that we're dealing here with a purely biological issue. We're not talking about saints on clouds or harps or any of that. We're talking about simply the way the biological structure works. Is that making sense? Okay. Now what HeartMath has been out to do is to take this issue of the heart out of the whole realm of sentiment, sweetness, light, hearts and flowers, and so forth, and put it into a strictly biological level. And it's therein that the real action lies. And so one of the big things we have to do is to wean the notion of heart away from notions of sentiment and that form of emotion into simply the capacity to relate the body, the brain, and the mind, and the heart into a single coherent power. Does that make sense? Now, that's one of the things that here at this institute, you've got a tiger by the tail. And I'd mentioned this to Bob Monroe many years ago, that he had a tiger by the tail. This was big-time stuff. But of course, I was hoping to see him link it in with what I'd discovered in India and a number of other people have, into a broader frame. But that involved what is loosely called the spiritual, which sent Bob right up the wall. He would have nothing to do with anything which smacked of the spiritual. This was strictly scientific. And actually, what he was doing was a radical break with the whole scientific community, which, believe me, has not been the great panacea we have expected from it. I've said quite often, and I'll say it again, that for the past century, science has been our most prominent, predominant religion. And as a religion, science has a very harsh and unforgiving God. And it has a whole batch of very unforgiving inquisitors out to sense out any heretics in the crowd and get rid of them. By what? Ridicule or just silence. We'll talk about how that has worked in behalf of Darwin, Charles Darwin, one of the really towering giants of the past 5 or 6 centuries, and how part of Darwin was accepted and the other part completely rejected by that harsh, unforgiving God of science says, purely materialistic. Now, let me backtrack and try to find out where I was in all this. For one thing, we have to take a break in 10 minutes. We will break at 10:30, then we have lunch at time is it? What? It's not till 1. Well, then let's take a break at 11:15. Okay, fine. Now, this vision of being coherent